Please join me in welcoming Dr. Christen to the stage.
Well, thank you all for having me. I hope that my voice is reaching you, and I have many people to thank for inviting me out here. First and foremost is Felicia, who has been a wonderful host, and I'd like to thank you very much for bringing me out. Also to Riley, who just introduced me. She did a wonderful job. And I'd like to thank the Price family for this lecture series and Westminster College. And of course, I want to thank the Utah Council for Citizen Diplomacy. It's wonderful to visit Salt Lake. I haven't been here in about 20 years. I came out here in my early 20s from Canada, took a tour of the West, and my initial memory of Salt Lake was that I had to sign a form to join a club to have a beer. I guess that's no longer the case. But I still remember it fondly, and I had a great day walking around today, and I can tell you it's a wonderful city, and I'm very pleased to be here. So tonight, we're going to be going through the history of the securitization of illness, if you will, and the securitization, therefore, of health. And in fact, it's an ancient story. It begins thousands of years ago. And so a lot of public health professionals and medical professionals sometimes take umbrage at the fact that health and security are associated in the modern era. And I think it's important to understand that this is not a new development. This is not novel. It's in fact ancient. And so let's explore these linkages. So I'm going to roll through the history pretty quickly. The first thing that occurs is the Plague of Athens in 430 BC. And the Plague of Athens, which was chronicled in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, is now thought to have been caused by typhus or typhoid fever, and probably both of them. The contagion was thought to have come from Africa, but it's never been determined that that was completely the case. What it did is it killed roughly 1/3 of the Athenian population. It killed about 1/3 of the army as well. And it struck down the Athenian leader Pericles, which was a turning point in the Athenian war against Sparta. Pericles was a highly effective leader, and his death due to the contagion marked a dramatic change in the ability of the Athenians to prosecute that war. Ultimately, it destabilized Athenian society enormously and eroded their ability to project power against Sparta. Another thing that happened was the plague of Justinian. Of course, it seems to have played a major role in the collapse of the Byzantine Empire and so forth. I won't linger on these things. I'll roll ahead a little bit to a fun thing called the Black Death. Now, Halloween is coming up. So this is all kind of strangely appropriate in a way. My wife likes to kid me that I deal with all of these very dark subjects, and I said, well, it's Halloween, it's okay, we can deal with this. The Black Death was brought to Europe by a thing called the Silk Road, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. It was a trade route that stretched from East Asia all the way across the northern steppes of India to the Mediterranean. And it basically sweeps into what is now known as Crimea in 1346, and then sweeps into Italy, northern Italy in 1347, and so forth. The consensus figure is that roughly 30 to 40% of the European population died from the Black Death in multiple waves that swept across the population over the centuries. And it was central in the transformation of cities like Venice. Venice, which was once a really thriving trade empire, after the Black Death hit it several times, it became what we now know as a museum city. There were many things that happened during this period. The Black Death generated a lot of inter-religious hostility. Most people don't know that. But in particular, Christians set upon Jews and so forth, primarily because Jews were accused of poisoning the local wells. Of course, they didn't know back then, right, that it was bacterial in origin, and since they didn't have any knowledge of germ theory, they looked for scapegoats and so forth. So this was a problem, and they also scapegoated the Roma population, which are now known as gypsies. And of course, these traditions of scapegoating persist into the modern era. The first structures of public health governance, so this is where my political science kicks in. The first structures of public health governance arose in Venice, and in Florence, and Milan, in northern Italy. And that's not commonly known, that northern Italy really is the epicenter of modern public health in many ways. Quarantine, which is derived from the Italian word quarantenaria, basically means 40 days, right? And quarantine involved a 40-day restriction upon ships at sea coming into the ports of northern Italy. So that's where that originates, and it actually started on 20 March 1348. Land-based quarantines are then put in place for the first time by Duke Visconti of Milan in the cities of Mantua and Ragusa in 1374. And so this is really where the modern ideology of order, if you will, in terms of maintaining control over populations during times of epidemics, it originates in northern Italy during this period. Florence, the city of Florence, was the first to begin the practice of what we call cordon sanitaire, right? Restrictions to keep people in place and keep them from moving about during times of plague. And in fact, Florence was the first to issue what we call health passports. Now, if you go over to northern Italy now, you can still see in some of the museums health passports that are displayed there, right? And the notion was that you would not be allowed to travel from town to town, from city to city, unless you had, in fact, a health passport verifying that you were free of the plague. If you did travel with that health passport, you could be summarily executed by the local forces, and they did do that. Another interesting and fun fact about the plague, it got so bad that in 1739, the Habsburg Empire, which of course stretched from Austria-Hungary all the way over to Spain, initiated what we call plague control zones. And in these zones, the military were ordered to fire upon unauthorized travelers. So if you didn't have authorization, you'd literally be shot and killed. Fun times, right? Okay. This all leads to what we now call contagionism. So in my last book on the subject, Contagion and Chaos, the word contagionism arises from this kind of heavy-handed draconian approach by governments to dealing with their own populations during times of plague. And it exemplifies the tensions between the protection of the public good versus the protection of individual rights. And you'll see in the Ebola examples that are coming up how these tensions played out not only in West Africa, but also in the United States of America. Some interesting and quick stories. I was born in Canada, as you may have heard, and I have dual citizenship, but Canada would not exist unless it was for smallpox. And most people don't know this, but Benedict Arnold, before he turned against the United States, led an attack on Quebec City in 1775, and smallpox entered the ranks of the U.S. Revolutionary Army and decimated it. And without smallpox decimating the American armies, it's very likely that Quebec City would have fallen. And you would have one really big state north of the border. It wouldn't be a border. Canada would just be one big state. Okay. In terms of other epidemics, one of the greatest epidemics that, again, people don't talk about enough are the epidemics of cholera that swept through Europe in the 1830s. And they swept across Europe, destabilizing France, Prussia, which is now Germany, Russia, and England to a considerable extent. In France, this combined with the ideology of the time, what became later known as social Darwinism, that the rich were plotting to basically kill off the poor. And so the perception by the poor was that the elites were literally poisoning them in an attempt to kill them off. And this engendered or led to a whole series of riots and attacks upon government officials across France. So in response, the French government cracked down on the population, and of course that led to further riots and so forth, and an almost unending cycle of violence that lasted for several years. Ultimately, this all, of course, all leads to the securitization of health, right? As the state, the government starts to see epidemics as a threat to the material and to the ideational interests of the government. And it also leads to the rise of what we now call military medicine. So the Europeans, in their quest to basically dominate the world in the era of imperialism, right? They realized that they couldn't get into certain parts of the world, the tropical regions of the world, due to things like yellow fever and malaria and so forth. And of course, military medicine was developed in order to combat that. And one of the great examples of this comes from gin and tonic. Now, I'm sure many of you enjoy the fabulous drink that is gin and tonic. I do as well, so on occasion, only on Halloween. But what is the tonic in gin and tonic? It is in fact quinine, right? So back during the day, the British would pour gin into the quinine in order to create a mix that was palatable for them. And that, of course, was anti-malarial. That's where gin and tonic comes from, just in case you wanted to know. It's good. That tidbit is good for cocktail parties. They're gonna like it. Let's pull down a bit. And since it's almost Halloween, I wanted to introduce you to this is what plague doctors, and I use the term doctor loosely, used to wear back in the Middle Ages. And trust me, it might inspire a bit of fear in you if your physicians were all wearing these masks. So, roll a little forward. There we go. So the influenza pandemic of 1918 didn't really last from 1918, or just for 1918. It really originated in 1917, I think. And I crawled through a lot of dusty vaults in Berlin and East Berlin and in Vienna, Austria, in order to unearth some interesting statistics on that had never been checked out at the library before. In fact, when I got these boxes of materials from this one elderly librarian in Vienna, I asked her, I said, when was the last time this was checked out? And she said, "Sir, Herr Professor, never." And I said, "What do you mean, never? How's that even possible?" And she said, "Well, it was entered in 1921, and no one has ever requested it, so you're the first to do it." Of course, if you're a social scientist, that's a gold mine, right? You're thinking, "Hey, bingo, this is wonderful." And in these vaults of data that the Germans and Austrians had collected was evidence that, in fact, a precursor to the influenza pandemic may have started in and around Steiermark in Austria in 1917. It was so bad that the Austrian crown appointed Siegfried Roosevelt, who was a local doctor, to go around the country basically tabulating all of this data and so forth. And so there's some interesting questions about this, and many of my friends who are virologists have asked, well, do you think we might disinter some of the cadavers from those years and see if there are any traces of a precursor to the influenza? We can talk about that more later. Bottom line is, the Spanish flu, as it came to be known, killed about 50 million people worldwide, sickened hundreds of millions. There was enormous differential mortality, so it affected different societies differently. Alfred Crosby, in one of his famous books called America's Forgotten Pandemic, said, well, the flu affected everybody equally. That was his assertion, and I love Crosby's work, but that wasn't true. Japan was the least affected on the planet. Less than 0.5% of the Japanese population succumbed to it. The Samoans, on the other hand, were decimated. Roughly 1/3 to 1/4 of the Samoan population was killed within 1 year by the virus for various reasons. The virus was intensified by World War I. And this makes sense, right? When you have literally millions of people moving around the planet, being shipped across the ocean in the holds of ships, being holed up in military camps, and young men fighting in trenches under terrible conditions of deprivation, right? Terrible food and so forth. It was easy for a virus to spread rapidly, and it did so. The least affected countries, interestingly, in terms of the combatants in World War I, were Britain and France. The most affected countries were the United States, Germany, and Austria-Hungary. And there are several things to think about. Again, I'm going to leave that for the Q&A because that can take some time to explain that. So, when we talk about the securitization of health, everyone points at a number of scholars, of which I'm one, in the 1990s, and they say, well, in political science, you guys have re-securitized health. No, we haven't, right? Well, there's a re-securitization of health, but the securitization of health, let's put it that way, is, as you know, ancient, right? It goes all the way back to Athens. What did happen, though, is that in the 1990s, scholars around the world and national security folks became very interested in the effects of the HIV/AIDS pandemic that is sweeping the globe, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. As a result of these concerns, in the year 2000, the United States National Intelligence Council issued a national intelligence estimate that defined disease as a threat to national security. And the Clinton administration took that very seriously. In fact, in January of that year, they declared HIV/AIDS a threat to national security. And then the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 1308 later that year, declaring the AIDS pandemic a threat to international security. So the Clinton administration was truly the first American or US administration to take the threat of disease seriously. Then, of course, it was followed up in terms of, in fall of 2001, you had the Amerithrax attacks, which were the anthrax attacks through the US postal system, right? That was during the Bush administration and so forth. 2003 had SARS. Now, SARS was basically pretty ephemeral, but it actually resulted in significant economic damage. About $50 billion in lost trade as a result throughout the Pacific Rim region. So even though it didn't kill that many people, it was seen as a considerable problem. The Ebola epidemic of 2014-2015 reignited concern about contagion, right? And in fact, the US response wasn't very much security-based. So, now we're into the origins of Ebola. It was first ID'd officially in the Congo in 1976, and it's a filovirus. It is thought to reside within fruit bat populations throughout a belt in sub-Saharan Africa that runs all the way from West Africa clear across to approximately the border of Kenya. They're still trying to figure it out because, of course, bat populations move around and so forth. The lethality for Ebola is typically in the range of 80 to 90% of those infected perish. But this strain in 2014-2015 was different. Its lethality rate was much lower, approximately 50%. And the lower lethality was in fact problematic because it allowed the contagion to spread further and faster than ever before. Now, as you probably know from multiple Hollywood movies, typically Ebola burns through a population so rapidly that it literally cannot escape, right? It kind of creates a gravity well, and because it consumes its host so rapidly, they can't get anywhere, they're too sick. That was not the case in 2014. These people were sickened by Ebola, but they had enough strength and mobility to try to get out of the original zone of endemicity and make it to the hospitals. And this, of course, helped it spread rapidly across the infrastructure of West Africa by motorcycles, cabs, cars, and so forth. This is an indication of morbidity, okay, of the Ebola Zaire virus from 2014-2016. I'm not sure if you guys can make it out. Yeah, that's pretty good. Okay, so Guinea is the blue line, Liberia is the red line, and Sierra Leone is the green line. And of course, as you can see, the greatest incidence of Ebola Zaire was in fact in Sierra Leone. Guinea was affected, but not to the same extent as the other two nations. Demographically, the total mortality, and there's some small variance on this, was about 11,300 people perished from the epidemic. The morbidity, in other words, those sickened, was at least 28,600. That's a conservative estimate because, of course, it was hard to get out into the hinterlands of these regions and accurately estimate everyone who had been sick. One of the saddest things, of course, associated with the epidemic is there were 30,000 orphans that resulted from this who lost at least one of their parents, right? And those orphans, well, let's just say that in West Africa right now, with the current state of poverty and disarray, and at times it's been very difficult to care for them. I'll march through the timeline really quite quickly. Patient 0 was a 2-year-old young male in the city of Milniamdu in Guinea, and he died in 2013. The CDC announced an outbreak. Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, warned the World Health Organization a number of times, but the WHO actually accused MSF of scaremongering. Now that's fascinating to me, right? That you could have a bunch of highly trained doctors working for a world-renowned, recognized NGO like MSF, and the WHO would basically accuse them of inflating the stats and scaremongering. After the fact, the WHO finally declares an international health emergency, but it was late and it ignored their own international health regulations. They should have announced it literally months before they did. And in terms of the USA, on 30th of September, Thomas Duncan was diagnosed with Ebola in Dallas in the United States. Now I want to talk a little bit about the psychology of all of this, because this is not frequently discussed. One of the great problems with contagion is fear. Fear is often as dangerous as death and illness, because people freak out during times of epidemic. And not just in West Africa, but in Colorado Springs, where I live, in Dallas, where many of my friends live, people all across America were very concerned, right, about the potential for Ebola to spread to their cities. And I remember in Colorado Springs, I was on the television, I was on TV all the time, and the news outlets were trying to get me to whip it up, and they were saying, well, don't you think it's coming to Colorado Springs? And I said, no, it's really probably not coming to Colorado Springs, and everybody should just chill out and relax. But the media was really trying to whip it up, at least in Colorado. Within West Africa, there were real problems, though. There were bodies in the streets, there were runs on the banks. The reason there were bodies in the streets is because most of the healthcare workers didn't have proper equipment to clean the bodies up, right? Those who had died, so they wouldn't touch them. So you see this lingering effect, right, where your corpses would be in the streets surrounded and pools of blood, and the government literally wouldn't touch them. The runs on banks occurred because people were concerned that the banks would go insolvent and they would lose all their money and so forth. There were attacks on international healthcare workers throughout the entire region. There were attacks on government civil servants as well. And in totality, there was a massive distrust of medical and state personnel throughout the three affected nations in West Africa. All of this, of course, the panic, the rioting, the violence led to significant political oppression throughout the region. And I'll show you pictures of this. This political oppression echoed what we saw in France during the cholera epidemics of the 1830s. So one of the arguments I'm going to make to you all is that human beings really haven't changed over the centuries. We're not a lot better in terms of responding to epidemics. We still are very fearful, very emotional, and often somewhat lacking in terms of common sense during these times. So to get a little heavy on you, Jackson Kareka and I published an article in Global Health Governments last year about these psychological dynamics in terms of epidemics, what we call the fear-apathy cycle. And the notion here is that there's a constant oscillation within human beings between steady states of apathy punctuated by fear. And why is this? It's because human beings exhibit what we call dual processing in terms of our cognition. System number one in the brain is that associated with intuition, emotion, and heuristics, which are mental shortcuts. System two is what we associate with reasoning. The idea here is that, for the most part, humans are going along with system two, reasoning and so forth, but in times of plague, system one will kick in, right? And we will start to resort to emotion and heuristics and intuition in terms of judging what to do. And this can drive us to take some very irrational courses of action. The availability heuristic is a term that contributed to the outbreak too. The future did not look like the past. And I'll come back to this in the conclusion a little bit. There's also this thing called probability neglect, where humans have bimodal expectations of what's going on. And that means that we either expect a disease to be inconsequential or the apocalypse. There's very little middle ground, right? So people will think, oh, it's nothing, it's nothing, it's nothing, and then there's a collective freak out. as we all think it's the end of the world. And those two things reinforce each other. The availability heuristic and probability neglect actually reinforce each other in a negative way. These dynamics help to explain the global lack of preparation that we see year after year after year, and even the WHO's abysmal response, because we tend to not plan for the next epidemic. We go back to a state of apathy, nothing gets done, and then of course everyone freaks out when the next epidemic comes around and says, well, why didn't we do anything? Why didn't we develop healthcare infrastructure in West Africa? Why didn't we train more nurses? Why didn't we have more capacity out in the field? And this dynamic helps to explain some of that. In terms of effects on healthcare workers during the epidemic, they were infected at an incredibly high rate. A lot of them died at their posts. The healthcare systems in the region, as you probably know, are incredibly flimsy. In the USA, the nurses in Dallas were not trained adequately. They were not prepared. They had inadequate protective equipment, and the CDC really did fail to ensure proper training. The nurses' unions in Dallas were furious that the nurses had been subjected to this and had not been given adequate training or protective gear. And of course, several nurses in Dallas were in fact affected. This is a picture of quarantine in West Africa. So again, hearkening back to the contagionist impulses we've seen over the centuries. What happened here? This is at West Point in the city of Monrovia in Liberia. A quarantine was enforced over this entire neighborhood by military units of the Liberian government. And they did this. You might ask, well, why were they doing this? They did this because locals started to raid the hospitals. And they were pulling gear out of the hospitals that, in fact, had been covered in the blood of those who died from Ebola. So the government was, beside themselves, thinking, well, this raiding of the hospitals is going to distribute the virus all over the city of Monrovia, and so they started to quarantine them. In fact, quarantines were executed all over the 3 countries in West Africa, and they impaired the movement of food, they impaired the movement of health workers, and they impaired the movement of medical supplies. And this is one of the great problems with quarantine, right? Is that even as the government seeks to control the movement and spread of the virus, it actually is doing damage as well, right? By preventing the movement of healthcare workers and supplies and so forth. In Liberia, President Sirleaf declared a state of emergency on August 6, 2015, and this resulted in Operation White Shield, right, which was a series of rotating military quarantines all over the country in order to shut down the movement of the virus. At least that's what they intended. And you can see, of course, the guards with their, the soldiers with their provisional body armor, weapons, and so forth. In Sierra Leone, similar things happened. The government passed laws limiting public gatherings. They initiated Operation Octopus, which was similar, military quarantines all across the country, and the country went into total lockdown from September 18th to 21st during 2015. Economic damage from the virus to the region was extensive. I'll go through this really quickly for you all, but there was an enormous decline in trade and obviously in tourism, huge declines in agricultural production, primarily because of the quarantines. People literally could not get to the fields to harvest the crops because of the quarantines in place. This all resulted in soaring food prices, massive deficits, and the drag on GDP for each of those nations was significant. Negative 2.1% for Guinea, negative 3.4% for Liberia, negative 3.3% for Sierra Leone. The World Bank estimates that it resulted in over $6.2 billion of foregone GDP for that region. Now that may not sound like a lot of money to us here in America, but I'll tell you what, for West Africa, that's an incredible loss. It's staggering. And the IMF estimates that even to this day, there has been a 0.5% drag on the aggregate GDP of the region because of the Ebola epidemic, and that's quite significant. The regional impact was a negative $32.6 billion by 2015. So that's for all of West Africa outside of the 3 countries. In terms of governance, I'm going to go through this quite quickly. The insufficient healthcare infrastructure was a real problem. There's a lack of beds, doctors, nurses, and supplies throughout the region, and of course it's helped to fan the flames of the epidemic. The perceptions of the government as repressive and illegitimate was a real problem throughout these regions because the citizens literally feared their own governments and felt that the governments were lying to them throughout the entire epidemic. So it's hard to kind of reach out to the people and get them to listen to you about containing the virus when the people actually think that the government is against them, right? Here are pictures of some of the violence in Sierra Leone. You can see soldiers using clubs and batons to enforce military cordon sanitaire. How did it affect international security? Well, even the United States saw this as an international security issue. In fact, President Obama declared Ebola a threat to U.S. security on September 7th. A few days later, you had UN Security Council Resolution 2177, which was issued, declared the disease a threat to international security as well. This declaration of threat mobilized the U.S. Department of Defense to provide aid and logistical support to West Africa, and it actually mobilized the international community. This is interesting. Prior to this declaration of securitization of the illness, the international community was doing basically nothing. Médecins Sans Frontières and the NGOs were doing a lot, but the community of governments around the world were doing very little to nothing, right? So it's interesting then that this UN Security Council resolution starts to mobilize support. In the US, the Pentagon created a rapid deployment force, and Northern Command, which is in Colorado Springs, which is tasked with containing epidemic diseases and pandemics, was also part of this. In the end, the USA, we sent 3,000 troops. We built 17 treatment centers and 7 testing labs, which was helpful, but arguably it didn't change the course of the epidemic, but it did help in terms of dealing with the latter stages of it. Britain sent troops, Canada sent troops, China sent a number of teams, and it's interesting because I know that a lot of public health professionals have enormous distrust of military forces. This is because, of course, doctors and nurses and public health professionals see military forces as inherently destructive and counter to their mission. But what's interesting is I would ask you all to consider that the military is a tool. It can be used for good or for ill. And in this case, the provision of aid by these various militaries around the world was really quite helpful. And it's in direct contrast, actually, to what happened with the militaries in the countries of West Africa. So in those countries, Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, the militaries were cracking down on the population, right? Generating a lot of fear and resulting in violence. But the militaries that came in from outside those countries were not using force against those populations. They were bringing aid. So it's far too simplistic to say that all militaries are bad, right? You have to be nuanced in your interpretation of how they're acting. So what are the cracks in the global health system? Well, there were a lot. First of all, the World Health Organization was basically inept. And that's sad because I know a lot of very good people who work there and do their utmost to help, but the leadership was very problematic and quite ineffective. They ignored their own rules, the international health regulations. Under the IHR, they're supposed to notify, declare a public health emergency when it showed up, and they should have done that months before they actually did it. Moreover, the WHO is underfunded and it's highly politicized. And even within the World Health Organization, units that deal with infectious disease have been progressively marginalized over the past 15 to 20 years with a prioritization of chronic illness. NGOs like MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, totally overburdened and underfunded. Médecins Sans Frontières are really the heroes of this story, in my opinion. They did amazing work out in the field trying to save lives. This is along with Samaritan's Purse and SIM and Project Cure, who also did some very good work in terms of trying to treat people and save them and so forth. In a response to the WHO's ineptitude, the United Nations had to create an entirely new organization called UNMIR, which was led by Dr. David Nabarro, in order to basically deal with the situation. So the UN cut out the WHO and said, you're not taking care of it, we're going to go in another direction. Persistent problems. Well, obviously global inequities of wealth, right? I mean, West Africa remains incredibly poor. And now that the epidemic is over, for now, because it of course exists in local bat populations, people have now forgotten about West Africa again, right? So it's the classic fear apathy cycle kicking in again. Well, the epidemic's over, we don't have to worry about it anymore. Oh, you know, who cares about West Africa? We're not going to pay attention to it now. And it's just a recipe for disaster, right? Again. There's a global dearth of vaccines, right? Name your disease, there's a dearth of them. Some of the more interesting things, though, is that the United States Department of Defense is now using tobacco in order to generate new vaccines at an unprecedented rate, right? So we used to use eggs, but the eggs aren't as effective as these new technologies using plants like tobacco. Global health governance persists in the WHO. Hopefully the new director of the WHO is going to be more effective. And one of the obvious lessons of Ebola is that the globalization of disease occurs. I had a good buddy of mine who shall remain nameless. We were talking about the early stages of the Ebola epidemic, and he said, but Andrew, you know it's not going to get on a plane. It'll never get out of West Africa. And I looked at him and I said, really? Would you like to put a wager on that? Let's just say I got a little bit richer. I won $20 off my buddy. Disease does travel by plane. Problems, volume 2. So this is where I want to go into a greater discussion of some of the psychology underpinning all of this. Imagination cost, I'll define as a difficulty in thinking about things that lie outside one's own experiences. Humans are bound by the availability heuristic, so we tend to ignore the possibility of anything that we haven't seen before in our own lifetimes. This type of thinking contributes to things like September 11th, right? FBI field agents warned the Clinton administration and the Bush administration that Al-Qaeda agents were planning on using planes in an attack against the United States. But senior officials in both administrations dismissed that possibility. And you know what the reasoning was? Well, they'd never done it before. Okay? That's the type of thinking that can get you in trouble. It's in-the-box thinking. Meanwhile, out-of-the-box thinking is really quite valuable. The second thing is probability neglect. It's the inability of most people to respond in a rational fashion to dire risks with low probabilities. So we can look at some really nasty problems out there in the world. For example, today I was reading about the Yellowstone supervolcano. Any of you heard about that? Yeah. Well, apparently it's heating up again. And if that thing blows, it'll be really bad for Utah and Colorado. It's a very low probability of it happening in our lifetime, but wow, if it happened, it would be catastrophic for the entire United States. Humans have this problem in terms of estimating these very dire events with low probabilities, and Ebola is exactly this type of thing that we have a difficult time coming to grips with. Finally, I want to talk about the global library of code, genetic code. If you think about the world's forests, rainforests, and if you think about coral reefs and so forth, these are global repositories of biodiversity, right? In fact, I like to think of them as these giant libraries of genetic code that exist on the planet. And every day, we're basically taking a match to them, right? In our destruction of the rainforests and the coral reefs, we are literally destroying all of this genetic code that could be used to craft medicines and therapies to save human lives, or to make the lives of people who have chronic illnesses much, much better. But we are destroying the environment at an unprecedented rate. Furthermore, this environmental destruction, this environmental flux is also probably going to release new pathogens, right? Variants of existing ones, or perhaps entirely new classes of pathogens into the human ecology, and it will spread. So the more that we continue to damage the global ecology, the biosphere, we can expect further surprises from Mother Nature. And here's some fantastic reading you should all check out. Thank you very much. I'd love to hear your questions and speak with you. Thank you. Yeah, don't be shy. Yes, sir.
I'm amazed at how long those plagues in the early ages lasted, hundreds of years.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's because, of course, they didn't. The plagues lasted hundreds of years because they didn't understand what was causing them, right? And there are two interesting schools of medicine at that time, if you want to call it medicine. There was what we would call the Galenic school from Galen, which held that basically illness was caused by environmental factors like miasmas and so forth. And that's what led to the plague masks, right? The plague masks were built like that, because they thought that these evil vapors were basically entering the human form and contaminating and causing illness. In contrast to the Galenic school, you eventually get the rise of germ theory, right, and the discovery of germs. The discovery of germs is not just through the usual suspects like Robert Koch, in fact. The first person to postulate it was an Italian named Girolamo Fracastoro. And Fracastoro actually was the first to talk about what he called seeds of contagion. In other words, these really he was thinking about viruses and bacteria and so forth. So you can go back and you can go and read Girolamo Fracastoro's works if you go to northern Italy, and it's a good excuse to go to Italy, so I suggest you do so. Any other questions? Don't be shy. Yes?
So you mentioned about the environment and how destroying rainforests and coral reefs can possibly bring up new pathogens. What are your thoughts about the permafrost melting and releasing old pathogens, but could they also release new pathogens that we haven't seen as well?
Well, yeah, that's already occurring, right? I mean, so we've already seen the melting of ice and permafrost in Siberia is already associated with, I think, at least 2 novel pathogens that we humans hadn't seen before. They don't appear to be pathogenic to humans so far. But that's right. I mean, it's just part of Mother Nature's package of surprises that I think is waiting for us. Perhaps one of these days the melting ice will release something that could cross into the human ecology, right? Now, I'm not saying it's imminent, and I'm not saying it has to happen, but it would be unreasonable to expect that it couldn't happen. Right? Great question. Yes, in the back.
You, excuse me, you said that that UNMEER was established.
Yeah.
What does that mean, and does it still exist?
What
do the letters mean?
Yeah, so the United Nations Mission for Emergency Ebola Response.
Oh.
Yeah, led by David Navarro. And he did a very effective job in terms of utilizing those resources to contain the epidemic. Navarro's one of the big heroes of this piece too.
So, it's an Ebola response, but does it still exist and working on other responses?
No, I think it's been disbanded at this point in time. But that said, it does have, it leads to some interesting questions about the utility and the efficacy of the World Health Organization, right? I mean, if the WHO could blow it so badly during a major epidemic in the 21st century, it has led to some serious questions from member nations of the UN and of the WHO about the WHO's efficacy. And this has led, of course, to new leadership at the WHO. It's far too early to judge that new leadership. I wouldn't want to do that for at least another year or two, right? But let's just say that the past leadership was clearly shown to be ineffective. And it's really too bad, because it really did tarnish the image of that organization to a considerable extent. Yes, red shirt in the back? Yeah.
Sorry, Nietzsche. You mentioned a lot of cracks in the global public health system, but what are some of the, what ideas do you see moving forward that we can take to help fix those cracks?
Right. Well, the first thing I think we need to do is, the Trump administration. Okay. The first thing we need to do is to get, most of the nations of the world interested in dealing with significant problems of poverty, right? It's inaccurate to say that poverty alone fosters disease. There are plenty of diseases like SARS that aren't caused by poverty, or Legionella, right, Legionnaire's disease, which are generated, in association with technologies, but and flourish in new technological environments. But poverty does have a very, very strong association with some illnesses like, obviously, malaria, Shigella, dysentery, cholera, and so forth. So one of the big things we can do in this country is try to get greater amounts of aid flowing to the developing world in order to create resilient and robust healthcare infrastructures. What does that mean? It means beds, it means nurses, It means food in order to augment people's basic nutrition such that they have greater immunity to infectious diseases. So there are a number of things we can do, what we would call the low-hanging fruit, like provision of greater nutrition that nets against malaria, just adequate sanitation, clean water, and so forth, that are not, they're not incredibly costly, but they're very, very effective. Now, Jeffrey Sachs, who's an economist you may have heard of, he's over at Columbia University, is launching a new initiative, a new Millennium Initiative called the Millennium Cities Initiative, and so forth. And it's very interesting because he's adopted a number of cities across the world, a lot of them in sub-Saharan Africa, and he's looking at creating these types of interventions, right, at a micro scale within individual communities to see if he can combat things like infectious disease and so forth, and poverty and all of their kind of interrelations. And it'll be fascinating 5 years from now to see exactly how that project is going on. Yes, sir, right in front of you.
Here's a similar question. Do you have any insights or predictions about public health infrastructure within the U.S. and rational responses?
Great question. So, one of the interesting things about the United States of America that most people don't know is that public health is reserved to the states, right? Public health and the execution of the laws is reserved to the states, not to the federal government. And that's fascinating because, of course, there's such variance in capacity between states, right? So in a state, I'll give you one example. A state like New York, which is quite wealthy, right, has a very robust public health capacity in terms of surveillance, containment, and beds and all of that. But there are other states in the union, like North Dakota, where I used to live, or New Mexico, right, which don't have the same surveillance capacity because they just have less money, and of course they have vast areas, vast territories to cover, and these just are lacking in terms of public health infrastructure. So that means that within this country there's enormous variance in terms of our ability to both conduct surveillance, in other words, see the emergence of threats, and then respond to them, particularly in the poorer states. And it leads me to think that we should perhaps have some equalizing mechanism, perhaps at the congressional level, to ensure that the poorer states have a little more money in terms of being able to do their job effectively. We also have other things. We have national stockpiles, right, of vaccines and so forth, and drugs like ciprofloxacin to counter certain illnesses like anthrax. But the stockpiles often go out of date quite rapidly. They're expensive to replenish. I worry that the new administration, in fact I know this, I know that the new administration, the Trump administration, is not making public health a high priority. They are in fact slashing budgets to science across the board. They are slashing public health budgets. And it's a real problem because I don't see this as a partisan issue. I think if you're conservative or if you're liberal, the health of the population of the United States of America is important, and we should not be politicizing this. So it's really unfortunate that they have chosen to slash all this funding to science in general and to health in particular. Thank you. Yes, sir. Thank you for that.
I want to follow up on the politicization of public health. And
Yeah.
I think particularly, or ask you to talk a little bit about global politics of race with respect to the WHO's, the WHO's response to this particular epidemic. But I mean, we've seen plenty of evidence in the United States of the differential impact of environmental threats and disease threats on communities of color. And so as you looked at the history of the WHO's response, did you see evidence that race played a role in the failure?
Well, I can't say it didn't cross my mind, right? That, let's put it this way. One of the things that I saw at the outset was a kind of dismissive attitude coming from Geneva in terms of its relations with the WHO regional office in Brazzaville. And again, these accusations of scaremongering that were directed at Médecins Sans Frontières, you have to wonder, like, if MSF was warning about an epidemic coming from a different part of the world, might they have taken it a little more seriously? I don't doubt that. I mean, I think there's something to that. But the fact of the matter is, if you actually really dig into it, and I have, the regional office in Brazzaville, in Congo, also thought that Medicine Sans Frontières were inflating the problem. And they literally said that and then communicate back to Geneva. So it's interesting because, then you have a question about, well, is the office in Brazzaville, are there deficiencies in leadership there as well? And clearly, that was now seen as the case. So the leadership in Brazzaville was also replaced, as far as I can tell. But I have no doubt that we don't take things occurring in sub-Saharan Africa very seriously in this country. We haven't for a very long time. And I've run into plenty of academics, unfortunately, who also don't care much about the region. And I've literally spent much of my career railing against that type of attitude because I see it as so counterproductive, so very unhelpful. So thank you for the question. Yes? No.
How do we define the differences between a virus and a plague? For instance, we have the Zika virus, and we have, is it numbers or?
Well, okay, so a virus or a bacterium can cause a plague, right? And plague is just a term we apply to any sweeping illness that cuts across the land and collectively freaks us out. So viruses and bacteria cause plagues, but the term plague is so misused, right? We should really be very careful about what we refer to as plague, because plague really refers to disease caused by Yersinia pestis, right, which caused the Black Death. Otherwise, we really shouldn't use the term very much. Yes.
You made, I think, a really great case that the health and welfare and national security of the United States depends on the health and welfare of the global environment. But you also, and I think you've emphasized that, looking at the U.S. investment in various disease areas, so there has been a focus on the chronic diseases as compared to the infectious diseases, which are the ones that are often frequently associated with other parts of the globe. So my question is, what are the levers that are available to sort of push the dynamic from apathy toward fear? Without getting, all the way to full-on fear, which you also pointed out is very destructive. It seems like we need to be somehow moving toward away from the kind of complete focus on the short-term issues, which are what are the diseases that are affecting our population in real time today, and having at least a shift, if not a complete shift, at least a little bit of a quantitative shift toward an emphasis on diseases that really could affect us in the United States in the long run.
Right, great question. So this is the toughest question that I ever get, primarily because how do you get humans to direct their cognition away from that bimodal response of complete apathy, nothing's going to happen, and then collective freak out, right? It's the apocalypse. It's very difficult to do that. I think that one place to start is obviously with education, in the sense that the more that the average person knows about public health in general, they're going to be able to make more informed decisions about, well, is this really a serious threat? How serious is it an economic problem, or is this something that is truly existential and actually threatens not only my life, but perhaps my family's life, and perhaps even the fabric of the nation? That said, it's difficult to educate, the American public en masse. So I'm doing this one step at a time. I'm starting with Westminster. But it's a huge problem. Another thing, though, that people don't talk about is something that I learned from Edward O. Wilson, who wrote a fascinating book years ago called Consilience. And Wilson was the curator of the Museum of Natural Sciences at Harvard. And in Consilience, Wilson talked about this ability to jump across the disciplines and bring these separate disciplines like public health and medicine, and economics, and ecology, and political science together to create what I would call an emergent knowledge. It's a knowledge that is greater than but qualitatively different from the knowledge generated in each one of those silos. And to that extent, I think it's really wonderful that we have colleges that can encourage students to literally study in multiple fields. right? To gain some basis of knowledge that you can use to interpret, right, how the world is reacting. So if everybody's just an economist or just a physicist or just a political scientist, and you never explore other regions or domains of thought, I think then we're likely to underestimate the actual risks of what's going on around us. And I know I sound like Francis Bacon right now, and it feels like the Enlightenment, but that was a good project. You know, it may be unattainable. You can't study everything, and nor can I, because my wife would get really mad at me. And she does get mad at me. She'll come down at 2 o'clock in the morning and say, it's time to go to bed. Stop reading all these books and journals and so forth, right? But I think that all of us can embark to a certain extent upon this idea of consilience, this idea of interdisciplinarity, bringing knowledge together to have a more comprehensive view of the world around us. Thank you. Yes, sir.
You did talk about using military in a productive way instead of in a destructive way. As far as the United States having the largest military in the world, do you see any regions where the military could be deployed for the future to kind of prepare for the next thing that's going to happen?
That's a great question. So, and thank you for raising it, because I really do feel that way. I feel that in my discussions with other people in public health, right, they almost uniformly target the military as this negative, destructive influence. And yeah, that can happen, but there are a lot of very good people in the military, right, doing some very good things and providing aid and succor to peoples all over the world. Classic example of that, of course, is after the Christmas tsunami, I think in 2006, when the U.S. military forces delivered enormous amounts of aid over to Malaysia, Indonesia, and much of Southeast Asia, right? And what is the military's involvement? Well, there's a lot of it. I can tell you, what can I tell you guys? I have to make sure I don't divulge anything classified. But the point being that the Navy has, in fact, a global surveillance network that's existed for many years. And it exists in a lot of countries, and they go around the world conducting disease surveillance to make sure that we don't get massive outbreaks of illness and so forth. So they're kind of a distant early warning line, what we call the dew line during the Cold War up in Canada. They're a dew line in terms of pathogenic surveillance. That's global in intent. And other divisions of, I used to be advisor to the National Intelligence Council. I stepped in a few months ago, but I served under Bush and under Obama. And you know, our global intelligence structures are also aware of this and working on it and so forth. So they're conducting surveillance. It's tricky though, because you have to be mindful of other countries' sovereignty, right? And you don't want to step on other people's toes and so forth. But yeah, the military is engaged in trying to prevent massive outbreaks. Thanks. Yes, ma'am.
You deferred discussion of the reasons behind the different nations having different mortality rates during the influenza outbreak during World War I. Is there any inherent anything that you have identified that made that difference?
Yeah, well, right. So I think the mortality in Japan during the Spanish flu was so low because the Japanese had a culture of extraordinary cleanliness, and perhaps even more important than that, their nurses were very skilled, very highly trained, more so than perhaps any other society on the planet at that point in time. So, pardon me. So when it comes to Japan, I would like to think that, you know, a very high quality lifestyle, very healthy living, culture of cleanliness, and of course this wonderful nursing infrastructure throughout the country really did help them in terms of at least containing mortality. Now look, a lot of Japanese got very sick, but they didn't die, and I think that the nurses really did help with that. In terms of the differential mortality amongst the combatants in World War I, that's really interesting. There is this thing called the Oxford hypothesis, and you're going to love this, because it's created by John Oxford, who's a professor of epidemiology at Oxford. Okay, so the Oxford hypothesis is wonderful, it's aptly named. And he seems to think that a division of British soldiers that was deployed in Normandy, so the northern coast of France, in 1915, was wiped out for the most part. by an illness, and he suspects that that was either a precursor of the virus that arrived later in 1917, 1918. But he thinks that those who survived, or some of them that walked away from that division, went back to England, may have carried the virus with them. In other words, his hypothesis is that the British population was exposed to a less lethal variant of the virus prior to its onset in the United States and Germany in later years. I have to say, there must be something to that notion of prior exposure, because the British exhibited the least mortality as a result of the Spanish flu by a significant degree. I mean, far below what the Germans and Austrians experienced, and far below what the Americans experienced. The French similarly had lower mortality. It wasn't as pronounced as the British, but it was still significantly lower than the Central Powers in Germany and Austria. So one wonders, well, yeah, how does that happen? Is it purely nutritional? Is it because the British are on an island? No, probably not. I mean, I think that there must be something in terms of prior exposure to some precursor variant of the virus. So if you want to check it out, read up on the Oxford hypothesis and so forth, or read this fascinating yellow book. I lay all this stuff out on the page. Yes, ma'am.
I have a quick question. I don't know how much research have you made to show the Black Death, and we're going through Dia de los Muertos pretty soon. But you know, the Spaniards go and conquer, and I'm speaking more specifically of Mexico because probably was one of the largest, most populated places. I mean, what if they would have been more resilient to all of whatever the Spaniards brought to the country? Could they have just maybe fought their war a little bit better, like the Canadians?
Oh.
And because were they unfairly in a disadvantage? I don't know how much history or how much even we know.
We know
everything.
We know quite a lot about it. Yeah, I mean, so the European conquest of the Americas through disease is fascinating, right? Because, of course, if you were a Spanish soldier, a conquistador, to even get on the ships to the Americas, you would have already have survived influenza, and you would have already been exposed as well to smallpox and have survived it. So those soldiers, the conquistadors, already had basically immunity, right? Because they grew up in the petri dish that was Europe, right, at the time. And Europe, of course, was, rife with illness. So this gave them, obviously, an immunological advantage over the Amerindian populations, which had never seen anything like smallpox or influenza before. And of course, once the conquistadors, and the other Europeans for that matter, once they got to the Americas, disease would start to sweep through the Amerindian populations, just with a speed that was unrivaled. And in fact, William Denevan, who's an archaeohistorian of public health, estimates that almost 80 to 90% of the Amerindian populations were wiped out primarily by disease within the first 2 centuries of the Europeans arriving here, which is an astonishing, right? I mean, it's just an astonishing Holocaust. And people say, well, do you want to use that term? And I think, well, 80 to 90% of the population is it's an incredible destruction of an existing population. If you go back and read the journals of the British captain Vancouver, so Vancouver was a British captain who sailed up the west coast of North America. Of course, many cities are named after him on the west coast. But Vancouver wrote in his journals that they would periodically go ashore to these settlements on the Pacific coast, and all they would find were bones, human bones that had been chewed upon by wolves and dogs and so forth. And the hypothesis is that disease raced across the trade routes in North America and got to the west coast long before the Europeans even arrived there, such that all of these human habitations were essentially emptied by the time the Europeans came. So it's a really sad and tragic story.
Yeah, because like you said, I have heard that it is worse than
from bats to humans.
You mean Ebola?
Ebola, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So the hypothesis in terms of Ebola's transmission in the human ecology, it's interesting. I mean, there are a number of angles on it, but the one thought is that the child, the index case who died from it, was seen to be playing near a tree in the days before he was struck down by it. And in that tree, there's a significant fruit bat population. And they tested it, and many of them, in fact, were carrying the virus. So he may have gotten scratched, he may have been bitten, whatever, or he may have just come into contact with the virus, lying about on a tree or something like that, or even a cadaver. But the bottom line is, Ebola transmission, while rare in Africa, it's clearly something that we're going to continue to have to worry about. And people sometimes say to me, well, why don't we just eradicate all the bats? No. Bad idea. Okay. For many reasons. First of all, does anyone really think you can eradicate all of the bat population in sub-Saharan Africa? You're on a fool's errand. And secondly, if you tried to do so, the ecological consequences would be incredibly destructive, right? Because of the proliferation of insects that would result. And you would probably see the emergence of other diseases as a result of that.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Okay, 2 more questions. Thank you, Felicia. Good. Okay, yes, in the back, sir.
Would you give a clear definition of the availability heuristics? What is it?
Well, let's go back to it. It's basically, where did I bring it up? A heuristic is I'm going to walk away from the mic for a second because I'm feeling cooped up. Can you hear me? Okay, all right. Heuristics are basically mental shortcuts, right? And because human beings are all what we call cognitive misers, we can't pay attention to everything around us at the time. So the brain filters quite a bit, right? In fact, we're filtering all the time. I'll give you an example. How many of you right now are thinking about your left foot? Now you are. Now you are, but you weren't, right? So the brain filters information that it deems inconsequential. And because we're all cognitive misers and we're seeking to use our mental faculties to focus on things that are truly important, like the yellow book that was up there. Okay, there's my shill. The point being is that heuristics help us to basically manage information, right? So they're mental shortcuts, and in a sense, they're kind of bundles of cognition. But the problem with these bundles of cognition is that they're often erroneous, right? So the availability heuristic is, for example, we will look at the past. We will frame our responses in the present and our anticipated responses in the future, the near future, based upon all of our prior experiences, right? And that seems pretty good from a hunter-gatherer type of strategy when you think about the human past. It makes sense that one would frame anticipated responses to phenomena in the here and now based upon our prior experiences, right? But that means that in a sense, we're prisoners of the past. That our minds are prisoners of the past, and that in many cases, because we're relying upon these heuristics based upon past experiences, we have a very difficult time thinking outside of the box about things we've never seen before, right? And in a way, it truly limits us, right, in terms of responding to threats that are unanticipated, right? And we tend to basically downplay them. And that's exactly, again, what happened on September 11th, when policymakers in Washington, from both the Clinton and Bush administration, said, we're not going to see Al-Qaeda use planes as weapons because they've never done it before. I'll give you another example. I mean, when we talk about climate change right now, right? A lot of the times, policymakers will say, well, we've never seen this happen before in our lifetime, so the probability of X happening is so low as to discount it. Again, they're thinking inside the box. They're using the availability heuristic to determine how they're going to respond, right, to what we might call nonlinear change. But again, in a sense, it really limits our ability to kind of to think about things that might happen, right, that could be truly destructive. Sorry, I'm not a social psychologist, so I can't give you something straight out of the DSM, but that's my best shot for tonight. I hope that helps. Okay, we'll take the last question up there. I'm sorry, I'll talk to you. Yes?
Author James Robbins' new science fiction book is called The Seventh Plague, and it turns out to be a virus that is fed by electricity. And I was just wondering, any idea what we have to look forward to?
Well, I don't think we're going to see one of those anytime soon.
What was the question?
A virus fed by electricity. I will tell you a funny story. So my old advisor at Columbia was Stephen S. Morris, who's a virologist, and he used to ride the train in every day from Princeton, where he lived, into New York City, and then take the subways up to Columbia, where he worked. And he rode the train every day with this guy called Richard Preston. Richard Preston was a novelist who wrote The Hot Zone. And he made a pile of money off The Hot Zone. But he got all his ideas from my buddy Steve. And how much money did Steve get? Not nearly enough. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
So we'll go ahead and conclude by saying thank you so much for coming to tonight's lecture. And please drive safe. Thank you.